Chapter 6, Heracles. Early in the second half of the 20th century, a notable change occurred in American television. A young journalist, along with a few like-minded colleagues, decided that the time had come to attack the television interview, a programming staple, in a new way. His name was Mike Wallace. His idea was to replace the pablum, his word, of the interviews of the time with in-depth, in-your-face probing into the thinking, the causes, and the controversy of colorful characters of the time. Extensive prior research was to ensure accuracy and relevance. If the provocateur selected for interview had abused a sacred cow or two along the way, well, that was a good thing. The new approach was a hit. It began as Nightbeat in 1956 and soon became the Mike Wallace Interview, which ran from 1957 to 1960. On February 25, 1959, Wallace's guest was the hugely controversial Ayn Rand. It was her first appearance on national television, and it would be followed by many more public appearances prior to her death over 2 decades later. But no subsequent interview matched this particular face-off. Rand had just turned 54 and had completed her masterwork, Atlas Shrugged, 2 years before. If radical, colorful individuals made good TV, and this was Wallace's quest, he was not disappointed in Rand. My purpose in this chapter is to continue the leitmotif of the Prometheus myth and show how Ayn Rand can be seen as an American Heracles figure. I intend to demonstrate that Rand, by her philosophy generally and her championship of reason specifically, has provided the means for cutting through the chains of Zeus in both his modern incarnations. These are his twin incarnations as government and as God, as I delineated them in previous chapters. In so doing, I intend to present Ayn Rand's thinking as an unleashing into the world on a scale not seen since America's founding of a Promethean-like defiance to authority. Rand gives meaning to the term radical intellectual. Rand the person. Ayn Rand was born in 1905 in St. Petersburg, Russia. From an early age, she knew that she would be a writer. At 16, she enrolled in Petrograd State University, where she focused on history and philosophy. She sought to understand man's development through the study of history, her major, and to objectively define her values through the study of philosophy. She lived through the revolution, but escaped Russia in 1926 on a visitor's visa, knowing she would never return. When she arrived in a fog-enshrouded New York harbor on February 19th, she was, as biographer Jeff Britting reports, accompanied by mental outlines of 17 novels, screenplays, and plays. Ayn Rand was a passionate woman about 3 things above all: Frank O'Connor, her husband of more than 50 years, America as the country of individual freedom and opportunity, and her writing. As she got to know America firsthand, she was dismayed to discover the extent to which American freedom had been eroded by the 1920s. This dismay, coupled with the fact that she had first-hand experience of the Soviet dictatorship and thus of how far a country could sink, throws light on much of her writing. As it matured, along with her command of English, her writing reflected her matured thinking as well. By the time of her best-selling 1943 novel, The Fountainhead, her philosophy was largely formed. By the time of her 1957 Atlas Shrugged, she had articulated it in all its essentials. This is the Rand that Mike Wallace introduces to the television world in 1959. She is more than ready for prime time. Rand on the vital role of reason. As Mike Wallace so skillfully brings out, Ayn Rand's ideas are incendiary. Indeed, this is exactly the kind of television he loves. In one person, he has a flaming champion of unfettered capitalism, as well as an unabashed champion of self-interest, or in her words, rational egoism. And most startling for many viewers is that Rand is an avowed atheist, though not a militant one. Rand was clearly intransigent on these issues, but she did not consider them the most fundamental. Several years later, she makes that clear. She says, quote, "I am not primarily an advocate of capitalism, but of egoism, and I am not primarily an advocate of egoism, but of reason. If one recognizes the supremacy of reason and applies it consistently, all the rest follows." End quote. For anyone seeking to grasp Rand in her role as a modern-day Heracles figure, the importance of this statement cannot be overemphasized. In 3 millennia of Western civilization, human reason rules only twice. The first occurrence is in the Greece of antiquity. The second is the age of the Enlightenment, the seeds of which are first sown in earnest during the Renaissance. I touch upon these 2 ages in previous chapters. Aeschylus, Aristotle, Albertus, Aquinas, and many Enlightenment intellectuals, including America's founders, revere reason, and especially in the case of Aristotle and Aquinas, how it functions. But none of these giants explicitly ask why it is that reason deserves to be revered. It would seem that they took it as self-evident. A not uncommon notion is that reason enables man somehow to partake of the divine. But for Rand, reason is a distinctly human, not divine, faculty, and deserves to be revered. Reverence for human reason is a theme of Ayn Rand's work, indeed of her entire life. This is clear in 3 works I believe to be among her greatest achievements. Each has a separate header below to indicate the discipline in which she is working. Reason in Rand's Ethics. In February 1961, nearly 35 years to the day after her arrival in fog-enshrouded New York Harbor, Ayn Rand delivers a paper at a University of Wisconsin symposium on ethics. At that point, she has fully articulated a revolutionary morality of rational egoism and has named her philosophy Objectivism. The paper she delivers at the symposium is entitled The Objectivist Ethics. Rand's approach to ethics starts with 2 fundamental questions. What are values? Why does man need them? That is, she starts with the specialized area known as meta-ethics, which deals with the underlying issues of a given ethics. In answering these questions, Rand makes a number of key identifications, among them the facts that only the concept of life makes the concept of value possible and needed, and that for any living being, life is therefore, of necessity, the ultimate value. But unlike all other living organisms, man does not automatically know what values he needs to pursue in order to survive and thrive. He needs to discover them and then produce them himself. Reason, along with thinking its process, is the means by which he does this, the only means. All other life forms have automatic knowledge of what they need to pursue in order to survive. By contrast, man has no automatic knowledge. It is from such starting points that Ayn Rand provides an objective basis for her ethics of rational egoism. She argues that man's rational nature dictates his survival needs. Of necessity, then, reason is man's cardinal value and rationality his cardinal virtue. And further, Rand argues for man's life as the standard of value and his own life as the ethical purpose. She advances an ethics based on the principle that human life does not require sacrifice, where she defines sacrifice as the surrender of a higher value to a lower one or to a non-value. Hers is an ethics of rational selfishness. According to it, man neither sacrifices himself to others nor others to himself. Just as life is an end in itself, she points out, so every living human being is an end in himself, not the means to the end or the welfare of others. Hers is an ethics in which the achievement of his own happiness is man's highest moral purpose. Hers is a moral code in which productive work, in her words, is the central purpose of a rational man's life, the central value that integrates and determines the hierarchy of all his other values. In the political realm, her moral code promotes the basic social principle that no man may initiate the use of physical force against others, and it promotes laissez-faire capitalism as the only social system under which the implementation of that principle is fully possible. Throughout this seminal essay, Rand clearly emphasizes man the thinker, uniquely surviving and thriving by means of reason and thought. She is not simply stating it, she is demonstrating it by observation of man, by contrasting observations of other life forms, and then reasoning on the basis thereof. Essentially, Rand is using the scientific method to define an objective ethics. She is defining an ethical system whose source is not religion, not society, and not subjective feelings. Rather, it has an objective source, namely the facts of reality. For the first time, ethics is the function of that which nature requires for man to survive and thrive. In short, the source is man's nature as man. Does Rand demonstrate that the faculty of reason deserves to be revered? For anyone who takes the time to understand the reasoning behind her ethics, the above is a mere sketch. The answer will be yes. For anyone who grasps the identifications of human life as the ultimate value, of what is needed to achieve and sustain it, and then of what is needed to flourish, the answer again will be yes. Reason in Rand's fiction. As indicated, Ayn Rand makes clear in her ethics that it is only through reason that man survives and thrives. Her fictional masterwork, Atlas Shrugged, underscores and dramatizes this. It is vast in scope, and now, many years after initial publication, it annually sells in the hundreds of thousands. Its theme, as stated by Rand, is the role of the mind in man's existence. In Atlas Shrugged, Rand presents man fully exercising his rational faculty to think, create, and produce through voluntary trade with like-minded producers. Also dramatized is the man who evades thinking, who sabotages his rational faculty and uses coercion rather than voluntary trade in dealing with his fellow man. Most vivid of this type are the many government business cronies who populate the novel. These are the individuals to whom readers of Atlas Shrugged frequently relate, so vivid are the parallels to the business world of today's America. Reason as the ruling force in man's existence is a theme that Rand clearly and compellingly illustrates in a way only possible through the stylized reality of romantic fiction. Rational men flourish when they deal with other rational men, voluntarily trading value for value. Irrational men, such as the multitude of today's government business cronies, use force to expropriate the wealth of the producer. It might not be right away, but ultimately, these types perish in their own corruption, as the novel dramatizes. Does Ayn Rand demonstrate that the faculty of reason deserves to be revered? For anyone who has read Atlas Shrugged and has grasped its parallels to today's heroes and villains, the answer will be yes. Reason in Rand's Epistemology. The Objectivist Ethics and Atlas Shrugged, touched on in the above, are two of the three works that are among Ayn Rand's greatest achievements. The third work in the trio is her Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. This work followed the Objectivist Ethics by 5 years, appearing initially as a set of 8 essays in Rand's journal, The Objectivist, from July 1966 to February 1967. Just as Atlas Shrugged is Rand's masterwork in the field of fiction, Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology is her masterwork in the field of philosophy. In this work, Rand sets out to solve the central problem of epistemology, that of concepts, known historically as the problem of universals. As Rand puts it, quote, "Since man's knowledge is gained and held in conceptual form, the validity of man's knowledge depends on the validity of concepts." In the foreword to Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, she clearly sets forth the issues. She points out that while concepts are abstractions, everything that man perceives is particular, concrete. This raises such questions as, what is the relationship between abstractions and concretes, and to what precisely do concepts refer in reality? Rand briefly indicates that historically there are different schools of thought. While some thinkers propose that concepts actually exist in reality in some form, others propose that concepts are merely inventions of man's mind. Still others argue that concepts are arbitrary constructs or loose approximations that cannot claim to represent knowledge. The complexity of the problem of universals is great, and its importance cannot be overstated. Rand recognizes that in light of the above solutions, the problem might appear to be esoteric. But then she reminds us that, quote, "The fate of human societies, of knowledge, of science, of progress, and of every human life depends on it. What is at stake here is the cognitive efficacy of man's mind." Of course, such statements are completely consistent with the advocacy of reason in her ethics. Ayn Rand's theory of concepts avoids the pitfalls of earlier schools of thought. Instead, she provides original, unique, and lucid answers. As in all her work, she is exercising reason, defined by her as the faculty which identifies and integrates the material provided by man's senses. That which rules throughout her writing is observation, keen observation, and then applying reason to it by a process of thinking. Again, the essence of the scientific method. Rand points to Immanuel Kant as the great subverter of human reason. His is the philosophy for which she reserves the greatest contempt. Kant's destructive power, she repeatedly points out during her life, is great, and his influence on subsequent thought is enormous. Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology is Rand's full response and antidote to Kant. Does Rand demonstrate that the faculty of reason deserves to be revered? To anyone who has studied and grasped Ayn Rand's epistemology, the above is a bare outline. The answer will be yes. She champions human reason in the face of those who abandon reason. She elucidates reason for those seeking to understand it. She defends reason against those seeking to undercut and subvert it. Rand on the chains of Christian unreason. As noted in Chapter 5, Christianity requires the unquestioning acceptance of its doctrines on the basis of higher authority, whether scripture, catechism, preacher, or teacher. Docile, childlike compliance is expected. The Bible states it quite clearly with, "Except ye be converted and become as little children, ye shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven." Christianity thus changed the believer's mind with chains of unreason and makes the weaving of those chains a virtue. Rand, by contrast, cuts through such chains and makes reason a cardinal value and rationality a cardinal virtue. In her ethics, there is no place for unquestioning acceptance of anything, not if one's goal is to live a flourishing life on this earth as a rational and independent human being. Regarding the post-Enlightenment mindset, Ayn Rand demonstrates the fundamental error of considering weakness and depravity as essential aspects of human nature. For her, the essential aspect of human nature, essential because it explains and makes possible the greatest number of other aspects of man, is his mind. Yes, many men are weak and many men are depraved, but these are not inherent in their nature. On the contrary, man possesses the faculty of reason, which enables him to resist and overcome, with time, weakness and depravity, should he have allowed such tendencies to form. But its exercise is volitional. Yes, weakness and depravity exist, but they are acquired by choice, and over time they can surely become habitual ways of functioning. They can also be induced, or at least incentivized, by other men. But these facts do not make weakness and depravity innate to man. Christians, as well as non-Christians, commonly hold that man has a natural tendency to evil. But as Rand points out, this conflicts with the general Christian belief in free will, Calvinism accepted. As she puts it, quote, "A free will saddled with a tendency is like a game with loaded dice. If the tendency is of his choice, he cannot possess it at birth. If it is not of his choice, his will is not free." Ayn Rand would say the same of the doctrine of grace, the widespread Christian notion that the faithful receive help in the form of God's grace to counter their innate tendency to weakness and depravity. Regarding the second tenet of the post-Enlightenment mindset, that altruism, or self-sacrificial service to others, is man's greatest virtue, Ayn Rand demonstrates why rationality is the highest virtue and not altruistic service to others. Throughout her life's work, she demonstrates that rationality is the source of all human achievement and all that is good in human life. She demonstrates that rationality is the great enabler of all the other virtues, such as honesty, justice, independence, and integrity. Her ethics is rich in content. By contrast, service to others, as a moral imperative, is an ethics devoid of content. As Rand points out, quote, "The beneficiary of moral values is merely a preliminary or introductory issue in the field of morality, not a substitute for morality nor a criterion of moral value, as altruism has made it." Does Rand sunder the chains of Christian unreason? For the Christian believer, the answer would be no. Chains of unreason tend to be self-perpetuating. To abandon reason is to abandon the primary means of escaping any chains. What Rand has done, however, is provide the means of sundering the chains of Christian unreason. There are honest Christians, good people, who do not realize the betrayal of reason their religion requires. Should they ever wish to explore that betrayal and address it, the means are provided in the pro-reason philosophy of Ayn Rand. Rand on the regulatory chains of government. Ayn Rand is famous as an advocate of capitalism. She defines it as, quote, a social system based on the recognition of individual rights, including property rights, in which all property is privately owned. For Rand, capitalism means pure, unregulated, laissez-faire capitalism. In short, she advocates capitalism without chains. Rand identifies America's system as not capitalism but a mixed economy, an unstable mixture of private ownership and government control. This volatile blend of free enterprise and socialism continually trends to greater stagnation and ever-tightening chains of coercive regulation. Eventually, and necessarily, she stresses, it leads to some form of socialism. After Atlas Shrugged, Rand devoted herself to nonfiction writing. She founded a number of journals, she wrote essays, she gave lectures, and she made television appearances. It was 2.5 decades of prolific output prior to her death in 1982. I want briefly to discuss 4 works that stand among Ayn Rand's clearest for featuring her as a modern-day Heracles figure severing government chains. They are Man's Rights, The Nature of Government, Notes on the History of American Free Enterprise, and America's Persecuted Minority, Big Business. Essay 1, Man's Rights. During her lifetime, Ayn Rand often observes that America is the first nation to be founded on the principle of individual rights, where by a right she means, quote, a moral principle defining and sanctioning a man's freedom of action in a social context. Because the founders based their new republic on this concept, America is the first country in human history to make society, including government, subservient to the individual and to moral law. The founders strictly limit government to one function and one function only, the protection of individual rights. In Rand's words, quote, the most profoundly revolutionary achievement of the United States of America was the subordination of society to moral law. Society, of course, includes the government. For the first time in history, rights protected the individual from the government. Rand strongly differs from the founders, however, on the origin of rights. Where they see rights as self-evident, God-given principles, she is the first to develop the deeper philosophy that provides the foundation for rights. Contrary to the founders, she demonstrates that rights are grounded in observable fact. Ayn Rand's thinking is a revolutionary development in the theory of rights. It is encapsulated in this seminal essay. It is vital to note Rand's insistence that a right is a concept that pertains only to freedom of individual action. That is, it applies to, quote, freedom from physical compulsion, coercion, or interference by other men. In the second half of Man's Rights, Rand provides abundant evidence that today's America has virtually abandoned the original concept of rights. As she demonstrates, America has taken the original meaning of rights to action and reversed it to mean the right to objects and services. This, she emphasizes, necessarily negates rights. It necessarily entails violating the rights of the men who must be forced to provide those products and services. Who does the forcing? Government does. Rights, reinterpreted to apply to objects and services, tacitly gives government that power. Group rights, Ayn Rand repeatedly argues during her life, are a total corruption of the original concept of rights. Essay 2, The Nature of Government. Despite her advocacy of pure capitalism, Rand regards a strong, properly defined government as an indispensable precondition if men are to live together in peace and harmony. In fact, she holds this view not despite her advocacy of pure capitalism, but because of it. A government, on Rand's definition, quote, is an institution that holds the exclusive power to enforce certain rules of social conduct in a given geographical area. As she explains it, a proper government bars physical force from social relationships. That is, a proper government makes reason the exclusive way that men have to deal with one another. This means, in her words, discussion, persuasion, and voluntary, uncoerced agreement. But as Rand observes in this essay, man can violate the rights of others. They do so individually or as members of a group. Because this can happen, rights necessitate the right to self-defense, and this is where government comes in. In Rand's formulation, if, quote, physical force is to be barred from social relationships, men need an institution charged with the task of protecting their rights under an objective code of rules. And this, she continues, quote, is the task of a government, of a proper government, its basic task, its only moral justification, and the reason why men do need a government. In short, a government, in Rand's luminous prose, quote, is the means of placing the retaliatory use of physical force under objective control, that is, under objectively defined laws. In her essay, The Nature of Government, Rand develops a number of key related issues. There is the issue of the scope of government. It needs to embrace three areas: police, military, and courts. There is the issue of whether government is evil by nature, and thus whether anarchy is the ideal social system. It emphatically is not, contends Rand. There is the issue of the role of the Constitution in a properly formed government. The Constitution's purpose is to limit the government, not the private individual, Rand stresses. Finally, Rand deals with the issue of how government can become man's deadliest enemy. It does so by turning its coercive power against the men that power is supposed to protect, thereby abrogating their rights. We see this happening in America today, Chapter 5 above, and throughout the world. Essay 3, Notes on the History of American Free Enterprise. This essay focuses on the history of the American railroad industry. Here is Rand as historian first, and then as penetrating interpreter of history. The following are a few highlights of what she uncovers. Foremost is the notion that railroads would have been impossible without government financial help. As Rand reveals, this is historically false. In fact, the railroads that solicited and received government help were the ones that failed. History proves that the most successful roads were built without government help. The failed roads carry a history of corruption, bribery, and outright dishonesty. All these were made possible because government intervention creates a system in which dishonesty is inherent. Rand presents case after case to substantiate this indictment, along with sources. All are part of the historical record. J.J. Hill's Great Northern Railroad successfully opened the entire northwestern part of the continent to development without seeking or taking a penny of government help. The evils popularly ascribed to big industrialists, Rand points out, quote, were not the result of an unregulated industry, the conventional view, but of government power over industry. In defiance of common belief and contrary to what detractors of free enterprise perennially claim, She points out that, quote, the villain in the picture was not the businessman, but the legislator, not free enterprise, but government controls. Essay 4, originally an address titled America's Persecuted Minority, Big Business. Throughout her life, Ayn Rand insists that antitrust, where trust translates to coercive monopoly in the mind of any trust buster, is the arena in which government coercion is at its most vicious in America. Indeed, her theme in this piece is that antitrust is nothing short of rank persecution. Strong charges, in support of which Rand marshals an enormous amount of evidence. Since her evidence is so readily accessible, I will simply touch briefly on some of the highlights and allow the listener to pursue the details as well as the evidence in the print or Kindle editions of The Prometheus Connection. Antitrust law is notoriously non-objective, to the point where, as Rand states in an earlier article, antitrust law gives the government, quote, the power to prosecute and convict any business concern in the country anytime it chooses, end quote. At every turn, the government denies to big business basic rights thought to be possessed by all Americans. It requires the businessman to prove his innocence if accused of unfair competition. This, of course, stands in blatant violation of the presumption of innocence principle on which America's court system is based. Yet it is an unavoidable result since under antitrust, as Rand puts it, a man becomes a criminal from the moment he goes into business, no matter what he does. As she puts it, quote, if a bureaucrat judges that his prices are too high, the businessman is guilty of intent to monopolize. If his prices are lower than those of his competitors, he is guilty of unfair competition or restraint of trade. If a businessman's prices are the same, the trust buster can prosecute him for collusion or conspiracy. The laws are adaptable and interpretation is always on a case-by-case basis. But once the trust buster decides to flex his muscles, the hapless businessman cannot not be found guilty of some violation of antitrust law. And the threat of such persecution always exists, for antitrust law is retroactive or ex post facto law, a basic evil, Rand reminds us, rejected by Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence. Rand provides ample evidence for each of these outrages. Real-life, flesh-and-blood figures abound in her address. Bureaucrats and judges are quoted, with their words standing as clear evidence that minority rights do not exist for the businessman. Consistent with the post-Enlightenment mindset, belief in the businessman's alleged depravity is unquestioned. Rand examines 5 well-known antitrust cases that stand as historical evidence. Of these, it is the General Electric case of 1961 that she views as the most egregious. As she puts it, this case is, quote, the ultimate climax which makes the rest of that sordid record seem insignificant. Reading this essay or listening to the address, it is difficult not to come to the same conclusion, especially today. Even now, more than half a century later, Americans regularly witness case after case repeating the same syndrome of persecution. One might ask at this point how such persecution could exist in America, the land of the free. This is another chilling portion of Rand's address, and in it she uncovers a number of related issues. Among them is the fact that throughout history, persecuted minorities serve as scapegoats for the evil of others. In America, she demonstrates, businessmen are scapegoats for the evils of the bureaucrats. Ayn Rand as Heracles, Looking back at the four works just discussed, can it be said that Ayn Rand has sundered the regulatory chains of government unreason? As with the chains of Christian unreason, the answer is no. Again, however, Rand has provided the means of sundering those chains. The essays Man's Rights and the Nature of Government, closely related, provide the essential infrastructure or political philosophy needed if America is to have free enterprise without chains. A proper understanding of the nature of rights and of government is far from a reality today, early now in the 21st century. Rather, Rand's political philosophy stands as an ideal. But without first the ideal, the elimination of chains will not become a reality. It bears noting here that Rand's radical political philosophy on a number of points generally stands in contrast to libertarianism. The other two essays we looked at, Notes on the History of American Free Enterprise and America's Persecuted Minority, Big Business, are also closely related. Together they deal with the dishonesty, coercion, and corruption inherent in any system in which government intervenes in the economy. Together they demonstrate that, perversely, it has always been the businessman who gets blamed for the sins of the bureaucrat. In short, both works cut through the lies and distortions which have always been used to justify chaining free enterprise. Chapter 5 above demonstrated that chains, whether from God or from government, necessarily coerce an individual's mind with an authority higher than his faculty of reason. Reason, then, is the only antidote to such coercion, and historically, reason found its greatest champion in an American immigrant intellectual. The world knows her as Ayn Rand. We have it in our power. America today is largely bound by chains, not completely, but largely. Many are the intellectuals working to keep those chains in place. Many are the people who seek to counter them, but unwittingly support them instead. Many are the forces that seek to break government chains only to replace them with others. But chains can be broken. Thomas Paine said it best. In the appendix to his 1776 essay, Common Sense, he proclaimed, quote, "We have it in our power to begin the world over again." Today's America needs to begin over again, and that will take a return to the spirit underlying America's founding. That is, it will take a return to reason-based defiance. Ayn Rand's philosophy stands as a towering monument to such defiance, the greatest such monument in human history.